Good morning, dear friends. Thank you all for being here. Today is Rosh Chodesh, June 1st, the 21st of Sivan, and we're studying the entire Talmud one page at a time, presently studying Maseches Shabbos, Perek chapter 5, and we're on Nun Gimel Amud Beis 53b. Hashem helps soon to be on 54a. Thank you all for being here. I don't want to dominate the whole day by yesterday's discussion, but I do want to add, we spoke yesterday about kameyas, about amulets, and I suspect that many of you are as fascinated by the subject and curious and intrigued by it as I am. So I just want to make two additional comments, maybe three. Comment A, we Amir Hashem will discuss this a whole lot more at length when we get to page Samach or so, 60, which is not far off. It's the next chapter, Bameh Isha. And that is actually the primary source or site of that discussion. We've been referencing that Gemara, so I just want you to know we're not entirely done with it. So anything that we haven't fully answered or we didn't dig deep enough into the how to make a Kameya Mumcha, a tested or professional amulet, we're going to dig a little deeper, Be'ezer Hashem, and exactly the formula. So that was point A I just wanted to bring to your attention. And so if there's anything unresolved, we'll get to it in Mirz Hashem. Point B, we have a very dear listener who is not able to join us in person, but graces us by listening to the recording. And he made a comment that I thought was important to reiterate, which is that we were talking about the scientific method and the absence of it in the Kameya. That is certainly not to indicate or insinuate that these Kameyas were not effective Jewish, and the person actually wrote it very succinctly. He said, we're talking about people, Chachamim of the Gemara, who were engaged in or witnessed Tchias HaMesim. Others with great powers affected many different kinds of great miracles. We discussed, how one great tzaddik could cause a river to flow the other way or the walls to fall. So although the Kameya is not quite that same technology, if you will, but it is certainly not to indicate that the holy formula or techniques of doing kameyas are not real or accurate. And they're certainly not in the time of the Gemara. So it's not just that they consider them authentic, but it would be appropriate from the perspective of the Gemara and from a traditional believing Jewish perspective to appreciate that there's actual validity and substance to the kameyas, which leads me to a third point, which is a counterpoint, which is that I was curious after yesterday's discussion, because kameyas are a important cultural part of Jews that are Kabbalistically oriented and also Hasidically oriented. I referenced the great debate regarding the validity of kameyas with amulets with certain writing in the time of Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the famous debate about the amulets. The debate wasn't if they're valid. The debate, if amulets are valid, the debate if these were kosher and in accordance to Jewish law. So I was curious to see what the Lubavitcher Rebbe had to say about amulets. He was certainly a tzaddik whose blessings and many miracles resulting of his blessings and instructions are well documented. And I was curious to see what he had to say about amulets. And I'll tell you, from the fact that I wasn't very aware of much discussion, it was already indicative. But I did a little searching and I reached out to some friends, and they referenced an article in Hebrew from Israel asking this very question. And the bottom line is the Rebbe didn't negate the validity of kameyas ever, obviously, but he did write that in today's day and age, better, if we're looking for sources of bracha, for healing, parnasa and the like, better to stay away from questionable kameyas, because the technology and the knowledge and the righteousness, both of the creators and ourselves, are possibly diminished. And he would very much encourage people to strengthen Torah, mitzvot, and bitachon, faith in Hashem. And frequently those were the anchors, if you will, that the Rebbe would advise people who would consult with him for bracha to use, Torah, mitzvot, and like. There are certain particular mitzvot that the Rebbe, based on Hasidic and Kabbalistic and the kind of knowledge that a great tzaddik like the Rebbe has that we don't necessarily have, the Rebbe would advise certain individuals and certain circumstances to engage in certain types of mitzvot. And so, for example, the Rebbe, again, not inventing this, but strongly would encourage people to make sure that their mezuzot and tefillin were kosher and appropriately affixed, and so forth. But the Rebbe, in the course of his guidance and blessing and supporting, was not super into kameyas and other segulot, as maybe perhaps others can be. And particularly today, it's wise to be skeptical of the industry of kameyas, but that's certainly not to negate the validity and authenticity of a kameya made by the great tzaddikim of the ages past. And so I just wanted to add that to provide a proper balance to the subject. And with Hashem's help, we will discuss some more. And I have found some other interesting sources, halachic sources and otherwise, on the subject of kameyas. I think we'll hold that for Samach and Samach Hamad Aleph.
Since you mentioned that, I wonder what was the role of, or what was the view on those dollar coins or dollar bills that the Rebbe used to distribute?
Professor actually asked a very good question, and I have no choice but to acknowledge that question, which is a very wise one. And actually, the article that I pulled up makes a similar point. The Rebbe himself never directly insinuated or associated those dollars to be as amulets. The Rebbe always associated those dollars with to be a shaliach mitzvah, to encourage the recipient to give that dollar to tzedakah. Where does, and now, why is there, and I myself subscribe to a point or to a degree to this, why do Hasidim or not Hasidim, Jews who are greatly privileged to meet the Rebbe or to own such a dollar from the Rebbe, why do they consider it to be a great bracha? Well, I think for two reasons. Number one, that the dollar was given by the Rebbe to give to tzedakah, but it was associated with the brachas that the Rebbe would give alongside bracha, v'atzlacha, or other type blessings, which were very powerful. There is also a very interesting Gemara in Baba Basra that says as follows. It says, Kol anoitel pruta me'iyov mitbarech. There are certain tzaddikim that when a person receives currency from them, it creates a type of bracha. So Hasidim or not Hasidim, Jews who are privileged to receive a dollar from the Rebbe, felt that by owning a dollar that was gifted from the Rebbe to them, it comes with great bracha. But to be clear, the Rebbe didn't primarily market it or present it as a kameya or a segula. The Rebbe saw it as a way to encourage and generate charitable giving. And the Rebbe would say, Gedoylot tzedakah, shemekareves esagula. When we give charity, it hastens individual and national redemption. And so that is the Rebbe's focus. But certainly, there's great value and appreciation to own something that was handed by a great tzaddik such as the Rebbe, and that's why Reb Beryl, Dr.
Yes. Would you say that the explanation that you gave for the Rebbe in terms of the amulets would include a man wearing a chain with a Magen David around his neck? And furthermore, okay, go ahead.
No, I think that furthermore might have been a red string around your wrist.
Right, I was going to say,
Right.
Furthermore that, and I was going to say, and a little bit connected is a male wearing a wedding ring. But I'm really more concerned because a lot of Sephardim that I know that I'm related to even who wear it, once the way you'll kiss them in zuzah, they'll say something. No, okay.
Right. So I only want to take a half a position here, which is always not smart. But number one, the Rebbe you will certainly not find the Lubavitcher Rebbe or most other Gedolim, Tzaddikim of this generation and the generations prior promoting the red string. Certainly not the Rebbe, maybe others, yes, or a Magen David.
Right.
That doesn't negate it, and I'm certainly not here to talk about the merits or the dismerits of it. It is a space because I don't engage in it that I'm not fully qualified to weigh in.
Right.
I think the Rebbe would say before you put on a red string, make sure you're putting on tefillin, and before you put on a Magen David, make sure you're syncing up with. If you're looking for a segula, make sure
Well, the
you're
Rebbe always talked about the mitzvah. You always talked about
right,
mitzvah.
right. But the other question, which is, I just want to half address Roberto's question, and I do want to point out that we eventually do want to also learn some Gemara here, but these are all connected and important. The other question you're asking is about Beged Isha, if there's a prohibition for a man to wear a woman's garment, and that is also a somewhat complex discussion in the sense that in a time or era where men in society wear necklaces or pendants, such as a Magen David, there are certainly legitimate halachic opinions that would say that would not be considered Beged Isha. There are others that would say that it may yet have an element of Beged Isha. So my advice, they're probably bigger and better ways to get to insinuate and to try to pick on our friends. But if someone is wondering, should I start? I don't think you need to push them to start wearing it either. That's my opinion. But again, there's zero judgment for someone that does wear it, and there's certainly something very good to say about a person that's proud of their Jewish identity. And so that's my half answer.
Rabbi, there's one more element to a dollar that people got from the Rebbe, which is different from a kameya. It is there to encourage you to do mitzvahs.
Yes.
One would hope that when a person holds that dollar and looks at that dollar, not necessarily looking for a cure.
Correct. But just to get back to the professor before we share the screen again to the Gemara, that was a very wise and keen question about the dollar of the Rebbe, and I'm glad you asked it. And this article, basically, the Rebbe was, for the most part, aside for explicit segula of mitzvos, the Rebbe was for downplaying the esoterics and looking more at the direct impact. So the Gemara says that if you take a pruta from a tzaddik, so there's a value to that. But more importantly, shlichus mitzvah. If a Jew is engaged in doing a mitzvah of tzedakah, that's going to bring bracha to them. And if a Jew is engaged in giving tzedakah on behalf of or in representation of the Rebbe, certainly you want to have that kind of association with the Rebbe's encouragement to tzedakah and the Rebbe's bracha and the like. And the Rebbe would I actually have to add one more thing really briefly, and I've not fully researched, but there one kind of amulet-ish, it's not really a kameya, but the one kameya-ish thing that the Rebbe did encourage was the shir lamalot. There was an ancient, I think, Sephardic tradition actually, based on Kabbalistic and somewhat connected to the amulet-ish world, to hang a paper that has the shir lamalot. Is it kuf lamed? I believe it is, but I may be off. What is it's the shir lamalot asayin ayal haram? I believe it is. And so the Rebbe it did encourage hanging that up in the presence of the baby's crib and in the home where the baby is. But the Rebbe didn't talk about it so much as a kameya, as much as surrounding a child from the moment they're born with holy words, holy psukim, holy tefillot. And the Rebbe more broadly wanted a child to be, and everyone to be, in an environment full of kedusha, holy books, holy words of Torah, and positive messages from the moment of birth, if not sooner. So the Rebbe did, that would be the one area of a kameya-ish kind of thing that the Rebbe did encourage, but I believe the Rebbe's reasoning was not to negate the segula of it, but it was also strongly connected to surrounding a child with holiness and words of Torah from the moment they're born. And that will close for the moment. We're not closing the door for good, but for the moment, that will close our discussion about kameyas. But now I just have to add one last thing, which is it's been brought to my attention that there's quite an industry for kameyas from great tzaddikim, and there are auctions where these kameyas can go for very, very large sums of money, because a great tzaddik, a great mikubal, whether from the Sephardic, let's say the Moroccan tradition, or from the Rebbes of the generations past, obviously there's great significance to a kameya handwritten by one of those great tzaddikim. And again, od chazon lamoed, with Hashem's help, we will yet revisit the subject when we come to our next chapter. And now, let's share the screen and continue our journey through the entire Talmud. We are finding Maseches Shabbos 53b. Please just give me a thumbs up that the screen is properly shared. Yasher koyach. So if you recall the very last conversation that wasn't Kameya related, we talked about the difference between certain therapies that are available to humans but not to animals. Primarily, we talked about if you're allowed to have an animal put in the water to cool off, to help it heal from achazotodam or achazodam, which we saw either Rabbi Steindl as heart congestion, or according to Rashi, based on our deciphering of the Old French, a kind of gastrointestinal malady. And the Braisa tells us that a human being can be put into the water, an animal should not. And this seemed to indicate that even when an animal is suffering, one may not alleviate the animal's discomfort, which goes back to our earlier discussion about the extent of which one is allowed to engage in healing an animal, to alleviate its suffering, and what kind of malacha might be waived. The Gemara answered initially that there's a difference between healing and other types of alleviating tsar. Because when it comes to medicine, when it comes to medical therapy, there is a greater concern, the concern of causing someone to do shchikas hamamonim, to ground up herbs, which was the conventional method of preparing medicine, certainly in the ancient world. And Reb Berel and Reb Allen certainly can confirm for us if there are elements of that to this day. And so therefore, for an animal, there was this gzera. The Gemara then asked the question, okay, so human beings should also have a gzera. You should not be allowed to go into cool water to heal, because it'll look like you're doing a therapy, and before you know it, Reb will be asking our Kohen Gadol to grind us up some goodies. So the Gemara says no, because human beings can occasionally go for a swim, or can go jump in the pool or in a lake, whereas animals, owners, don't take their animals, their farm animals certainly, to jump in the lake unless it's for therapy, and therefore at this point in the Gemara, that would be prohibited by an animal. So now here's where we are up to. We're in the middle of that conversation, trying to understand when, where, and to what extent is one permitted to desecrate the Shabbos for the purpose of caring for one's animal. The Gemara now asks, okay.
Sorry to interrupt you,
yes.
but I think we had a lengthy discussion about the permissibility to swim during Shabbos.
Mm-hmm.
The conclusion was that no, this is not allowed. Here we are talking about emerging into a pool on Shabbos. And it seems like the previous discussion doesn't apply here. Is that correct?
Professor, you're making a very good question. I just will remind you, without getting into it, because it's not fresh in front of us, that we distinguish between going swimming in an open and expansive body of water, and between a pool. And at the time of that Gemara, the indication was that, I don't know if it was explicitly in the Gemara in the commentary, that going into a bath of cold water or a pool that's not in the public and not expansive like a lake might not be a prohibition. And certainly the Gemara seems to be taking that stance here. But it's a good question. In other words, the short answer is it's a nuanced discussion about where going into water may be prohibited, may not be prohibited. Is it the act of swimming that is restricted, which I think was the insinuation over here. So here we're not talking about swimming per se, we're talking about dunking in the water. So again, when I said swimming, or jumping in the lake.
The issue there was the possibility of towel becoming too wet, and then you wring it, and that's a violation of Shabbos.
Carrying the towel is like the blanket for the donkey.
So hold on. That is one of the issues, but that was not the primary issue, if I recall, for prohibiting swimming. There were other factors, but again, related to swimming, hoshata, and related to being in a lake as opposed to an enclosed pool of sorts, which the Gemara there. And again, I have to revisit it to really give the full explanation, but that, as I recall, is what's going on. So here, again, I know I was to make it relatable, I said jump in a lake or going in a pool, but it is quite plausibly more going into a smaller cold bath And animals don't just go into cold baths. Humans occasionally would go into a cold bath. And that's the point the Gemara makes. But again, Professor, a good question. And I would say that question is in the style of how Tosfot might analyze the Gemara. We learned earlier Gemara that creates restrictions. And so that was a very important question. Thank you for asking it. And now let's see how the Gemara continues or goes on to the next question. Is it true that the rabbis are going to prohibit any kind of thing that might be akin to healing? Even if it's going to help save the animal? And as Rashi says, B'makom pseida ki hai gavna. Here we're dealing with a potential loss. The animal could die. And the owner rather, is going to take a financial hit. So do the rabbis really extend their prohibition of shchika samamonim, the prohibition for doing healing? I'm sorry, the prohibition for doing any kind of medical remedy, lest you come to prepare and do a malacha of grinding the medicine. And here we're talking about a financial loss, and maybe the rabbis should not apply their gzera. Tanya, there's a brisa that makes precisely this case. Apparently makes this case that if you're afraid of losing your animal, the rabbis are much more permissive. How do we see that? If one's animal is outside of tchum, as we know, outside of the city limits, one is restricted beyond a certain point. One may not go outside of the city limits of the city is referred to as tchum Shabbat, the boundaries for the purposes of Shabbos. And one would not be allowed to go there, one would not be allowed to carry there, and one typically would not be allowed to cause their animal to go around there. And yet, Kairala Vihiba, one is allowed to call the animal, to cause the animal to come back. And we don't make a gezerah in this instance that if we're going to allow you to go to the edge of the city limits and call to your animal and cause the animal to return to you because of your calling, next time your animal runs away, you or someone else might say, hey, you're allowed to retrieve your animal. And you could even come to schlep the animal, go out of the tchum. And so although there will be a good reason to restrict retrieving the animal, even through a call, we don't make such a gezerah, we don't make a decree restricting the owner because there is a makom pseida, as Rashi says. There is a potential for financial loss, and the Chachamim understand that if they don't want to be overly oppressive in the case of an extensive loss for the fear that we might entirely forget or abandon those instructions. As Rabbi Steinsaltz here says, apparently the sages did not issue a decree where there could be a loss and there's no biblical transgression. So the same thing should apply here. We should be allowed to cool off the animal and not be concerned that one might confuse cooling the animal off with actually preparing drugs. So it sounds like a good challenge. We have a text that really is very permissive. It waives any kind of rabbinic restriction as it pertains to retrieving one's animal from past the tchum, and it is compelling. We should be allowed to also heal the animal. Ravina is going to explain that the case with the animal being retrieved is very specific, and the owner is entirely within his rights to retrieve that animal, even on a regular Shabbos. Let's see. Amar Ravina. Ravina responds, no. The case where you're allowed to verbally call your animal back, here's a case where the animal apparently is outside of his tchum, but the owner is within his tchum. Now that sounds very strange to you, admittedly. How would you ever have a scenario where your animal would have a different limits to their zone of travel where they're allowed to go than their owner? So Rashi explains that sometimes two people could have two different city limits without getting into all the intricacies of the subject. And what's possible here is that he gave behema hamasura l'roya miyuchad. He gave the owner into the custody of a special shepherd who's going to care for that animal. And now the animal has the restrictions of his shepherd. So when you, the owner, are calling the animal outside of his prohibited, the animal is beyond his permitted space of walking, the owner is going to call the animal. It's okay, because what's the worst case scenario? The owner might go himself and actually touch the animal or carry the animal. Or not carry it, but go there and schlep it or prod it in a way that would be prohibited, because it's not prohibited, because that animal is still in the zone where the owner is permitted to go. Again, let me just repeat. The owner would be within his rights to walk right up to the animal, because the animal exists within the permissible range of walking for the owner. Being that the animal itself is not allowed to go there, therefore, the owner shouldn't physically approach it, but he can yet call it with his voice. You see Rashi. You shouldn't literally, with your own hands, retrieve the animal, because the animal is no longer in its zone that's permissible to walk. The animal really should only be able to go within 4 amis. Ultimately, he's allowed to call the animal, because the only tchum that really matters is the owner's tchum, not the animal's tchum. But you shouldn't go and walk. So again, let me just clarify. The Gemara asked, we seem to have a proof that there is a waiver to do things that are otherwise rabbinically prohibited if there is a potential for financial loss. The Gemara says that it sounds like a compelling question that we should give a license for the owners to do things they typically can't do if the animal will be lost. And now the Gemara answers no. This case is not a case where the owner has any major waiver. On the contrary, the owner would be within his rights to literally retrieve the animal with his hands. Therefore, to call to the animal is certainly an acceptable practice and not a proof that the Chachamim make all different kinds of waivers when it comes to financial loss of the animal. That is the Gemara's process.
Rabbi, I'm confused. There are rules for the animal. The animal, if the guy has a big ranch.
Reb Beryl, can I interject? The whole perek that we're learning here are about rules of what one's animal, Jewish-owned animal, may and may not do. It's not because the animal has a mitzvah not to do malacha, but the owner has a mitzvah to ensure the animal doesn't do malacha.
No, but if a guy has a large ranch, we have to worry on Shabbos which part of the ranch the animal could go to and can't go to?
Possibly. Or at the very least, if the owner is going to be causing the animal to move around past the tchum, that might be a concern. However, Beryl, the Gemara itself says that the main tchum to be considered is the owner, the human's own tchum. So the main restriction here would have been limiting the owner from doing things that are very close to leaving his own zone. So again, are there restrictions on animals? Yes. When it comes to tchum, though, in this discussion, the primary issue is the owner's own action. And therefore, because the owner here is entirely within his rights to go up to that animal, therefore there is no prohibition regarding that animal. I'm going to hit mute just because there's some static and noise in the background. Please unmute to continue questions, comments, and the like.
But Rabbi, can't the use of an akum to do work, Amlacha and Shabbos, would enter into Bernie's large ranch? There's no question, in my mind at least. Maybe I'm wrong.
You're asking as follows, and again, we've already clarified that I don't have a lot
I'm sorry, I was away for a minute.
No, we've clarified that I don't have a lot of intimate and detailed knowledge of how ranches work.
Okay.
So you're asking, believe it or not, you're asking, or you're saying that it might be impossible to manage a ranch without malacha being done on Shabbos, and so therefore you'd have to have Gentiles do that work. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
That may or may not be true. I don't know. But certainly the Gentiles would only be permitted to do work that technically a human being, the owner, would be able to do. And for example, feeding animals is an essential part of the animal's well-being, and they can be fed. Maybe animals need to be let out to walk around too. Well, that's part of the essential well-being of the animals. We've discussed
Milking
that's
cows.
permissible. Milking cows is a discussion we're going to get to later. We're not up to there yet.
Right. Well,
Good question. Good question. Let's read Rabbi Stein's also. For those that are still struggling with the understanding of Tchum, let's read Rabbi Stein's here. The animal strayed beyond its own Shabbos limits, which are determined by the Shabbos limits of the shepherd entrusted with its herding. However, the animal remained within the Shabbos limits of its owner, which extended beyond that of the shepherd. Consequently, the owner is permitted to call the animal so that it will return on its own. Because even if he forgets and fetches the animal, he'll still not be out of his tchum. The fact that the animal went out of its own tchum here is of no concern. So again, we thought for a moment the owner was allowed to actually bring something from out of his tchum, and the answer is no, he's not bringing something out of his tchum. The animal is out of its own tchum. But as Beryl asked, and the Gemara seems to be saying, we're not so worried about an animal's tchum on Shabbos. And then Tosfos just underscores that very point. Even though, worst case scenario, if you would come to schlep the animal, you would not be leaving your tchum. Lo yitiru ela derech kriya. You still should not actually approach the animal. You're only allowed to call it. But you're not allowed to chase the animal into the city. You're not allowed to physically do an act that would cause the animal to go into the city, but you can call it verbally, vocally. You can cause the animal to come back into the city, and that is this discussion. Now we have to go back to remember our earlier discussion. The question was, can an owner do medical therapy for their animals? What kind of therapy? Well, not therapy that's biblically prohibited, but all medical therapies are rabbinically prohibited, lest one come to engage in the creation of medicine through crushing up the herbs, which are a problem biblically. It's like teichen, grinding, which is one of the 39 malachis. The Gemara answered tentatively that we should be allowed to waive those restrictions because of the loss of the animal. And then the Gemara countered and said, no, the proof we thought we had, that there should be a waiver, is no proof. Because it's not talking about allowing the person to get into the zone of potentially breaking the Torah law, and therefore the Chachamim never made a gzeros of that sort. The Gemara is not going to continue and clarify. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Shchika Samamonim Gufa Tanayi. This, the question of if we make a gzera to not do therapies for your animals because of grinding herbs, spices, that is the subject of a Mishnaic debate, a debate of the sages of the Mishnah, the Tanaim. Rashi says, because there is a Tanaic Mishnah opinion actually recorded in Ebraisa that says that we would not prohibit medical therapies because of the concern of grinding up medicine. How do we see this debate recorded and presented? The Tanya, we have a Braisa that says as follows: Vehema she'ach lakarshinim, your animal ate too much vetch. I don't know what vetch is, but we see karshinim a lot, some kind of seed-like item. Rashi, she'ach lakarshinim harbe, he ate a lot of this food. The animal is going to be constipated severely because of the excessive eating of this food. And the only way to help the animal get past it is to get the animal running around and around and around, which would speed up his digestive process and hopefully cause the animal to pass these seeds. And otherwise, he could be in for a lot of trouble. That's what Rashi explains. Kedesha tisrape, here we're healing the animal. So the question is, what do you do? Pinkin A says, Lo yiritzeno bechatzer b'shvil shet tisrape. You may not have this animal run around the courtyard if it's Shabbos, because that is a healing, a remedy. And you're not allowed to do medical intervention on Shabbos with your animal, lest you come to prepare medicine by grinding spices or herbs. That's opinion A. Rabbi Oishia matir. However, Rabbi Oishia takes a different position. Rabbi Oishia says one is permitted to take this animal on a fast, rapid run to hopefully cause its system to run and thus be healed from its overindulgence on this food, which is not good for the animal's well-being. And so we see that Rabbi Oishia does not say you're not allowed to do something to heal your animal lest you come to grind up medicine. Again, Tanoi. Two sages of the Mishnah. One says you can heal your animal. The other says you cannot. Dorish, Rava explained that halacha Rabbi Oishia, the halacha follows that of Rabbi Oishia in that one is allowed to have your animal run around, to be healed, and we are not concerned lest you come to crush up other herbs. So now the question that we're wondering is this a unique waiver when the animal ate too much, or is this exclusively for these karshinim? So a fast peek into the code of Jewish law, which clearly quotes this very scenario. If the animal ate too much of these karshinim, you're allowed to do this therapy so that it should be healed. Similarly, the Shulchan Aruch continues and says, if there's an issue where the animal has this achzadam, which again we said either a gastrointestinal issue or a heart issue, and you're allowed to place the animal in the cooling water to be healed. And if the question is, if you don't let blood, it's going to die. Mutar loimer la'akum la'akiza. You're even allowed to instruct a Gentile to let blood. A Jew can't do it because that would be a biblical prohibition. But you are allowed to do a rabbinic prohibition, which is to ask a Gentile to help your animal to be healed, because otherwise the animal will die. Dr. Hammer?
It's funny. My question, 5 minutes ago, which was exactly that, because we spoke of it previously, which doesn't sit right with me anyway, which about using an akum for this. I don't remember, a month ago or whatever, it was an issue. So what this says, correct me if I'm wrong, you're alone in your house and your kid goes out to play with the dog and the dog gets hit and run by a car and the dog is bleeding and the kid comes in with you and the dog is bleeding, okay? And so you're not allowed to get on the phone to call emergency. You're not allowed to get in the car, okay? And the best you could do is to run to see if you could find an akum. Is that basically because it's a prohibition? I just want to. Apparently. Okay.
In other words, we're not allowed to do a biblical prohibition.
I understand.
For the sake of an animal, we're allowed to do a rabbinic prohibition. That's what appears to come from this Gemara. Now, the interesting thing is, it appears that we are actually more restrictive when it comes to healing humans than when it comes to healing animals. So it appears, because we're saying that by animals, we don't restrict a remedy that's the result of Xera, for example, Shchikas HaMamanim. However, when it comes to human beings, there are different tiers of medical crisis. Some of those tiers, and we're going to discuss it a little later, so I don't want to go into depth. Certain tiers of medical crisis, you can absolutely desecrate anything for Shabbos. There is zero restriction. You can even do a biblical prohibition if a person's life is in jeopardy.
Right.
However, for certain more minor medical concerns, one might, again, I don't want to go through it all now because we're going to study it in depth.
Right.
One might be restricted, and there are certainly medical interventions that are not permitted on Shabbos for a human. So I'm just going to read for you. He says, the Ritva asks, that appears here we're saying that there is no gzera for animals. When it comes to a person, there is such a prohibition. Because by a person, obviously, they're much more important, and it's easier to blind the boundary between an item that's not prohibited, a remedy such as, I don't know, and a biblically prohibited remedy. And the Gemara says, if so, we should certainly extend the same degree to an animal. So the Ritva says, by a person who's chashuv, a person that has a sakana, we can desecrate the Shabbos entirely. And even when there's a suffix, we can also desecrate Shabbos. So,
Rabbi, it's far from simple, because you don't.
Hold on. What's far from simple?
It's far from simple what you can do for a human being, because a person could have a headache. You can't paskin it's only a headache. He could be suffering a stroke. He could be suffering an aneurysm.
So if you have the slightest, if you have the slightest doubt that what's happening could be a stroke or an aneurysm, and everyone is encouraged to learn the signs of a stroke, then you can absolutely do everything possible. And even if there's a doubt, you shouldn't take the time to start saying, "Oh, maybe."
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Right away, you should call 911. And I understand. I was speaking to a neurologist recently. You have 4 hours to get a stroke patient to the hospital, or less, obviously.
No, there's also concussions that seem to be nothing.
So if there is
open-ended at the end of the
day. So again,
I
don't want to go into the details because we're going to study at length, but just to be very clear, if you have even the slightest doubt that someone's life might be in danger, or you're not sure, err on the side of caution and call 911 and desecrate Shabbos to the greatest extent necessary.
Yeah, that's why I have trouble when you say there's restrictions with human beings. I mean, very, very, very rare to, unless a professional. Nothing.
Again, when we get there, we'll see. Okay. We could think of many hypotheticals that are not a sakana. If you have a low, if you have anyways, okay. I said we're not going to go there, so we're not going to go there now. But we will cover it at length in Mir Tzashem. But anyways, the bottom line, Darash Rava Halacha Karvayoshi, and we looked in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's clear that there are certainly plenty of examples in Halacha where this is applicable, and the Shulchan Aruch actually quotes the two scenarios brought in Gemara. And although if you would have read the Gemara without this final ending, you might have thought that you could not put an animal into the water, remember? Yet, it is permitted based on this teaching and based on Rava's psak halacha. Let us start our next Gemara. But I want to tell you now, before we start, we're coming up to some very interesting stuff. I don't know if we're going to get there today or tomorrow, so don't go anywhere. Amar Mar, we read in our Mishnah, Lo yetze hazav b'kish aloi, that a zav, a male person that has a discharge that they don't want to get on their clothing, and therefore they might wear a pouch. They shouldn't wear it on Shabbos. Professor, I think there's going to be some discussion later on in the next chapter to answer some of your questions about maybe there's a difference between how it's affixed and the like. For now, we're going to focus on the goats because this is the chapter more of animals than humans.
What is interesting about this Gemara is that we have already mentioned that a Zav cannot go out with his pouch. And I asked you a question, so does it mean that he may go out without the pouch, that is applying Aristotelian logic? And it wasn't the case when we discussed it previously, and it's not the case here. However, when we talked about the amulets that prove or didn't prove to be effective, the Gemara said that we cannot go out with the amulet that wasn't effective. However, by inference, we can go out with the amulet that has proved effective. And I wonder, is there any subtle difference in applying or not applying the Aristotelian logic in these two cases?
So first of all, I'm just going to say we're going to talk about it more at length in the next chapter, which is just a few pages away. That's number one. But number two, I'm not sure I understood your question. You're saying that it sounds like the inference was a kamea that works, you're allowed to wear, but this pouch you may not wear. And so you're asking, why do we distinguish between a pouch?
In the logical mechanism, not actually in the conclusion.
Well, there's a big difference. The kamea, the amulet, if it's coming to heal an important or significant malady, it has more of a necessity. Again, now that we're assuming the amulet works, the amulet is contributing a much more impactful and necessary service than the convenience that might come with this pouch. But I don't want to spend more time here because we're going to end up spinning our wheels in vain, and the Gemara is going to have more to say on it soon. So I'd rather have the conversation when we have more data to contribute. But just I think the answer to your question is that there's probably a distinction between a severe illness that's being addressed with an amulet and the convenience that's associated with the pouch. But again, our Gemara is not even really going to focus on that at all. The Gemara is going to talk about the goats. Nor a goat should go out, says our Mishnah, with a pouch on the udders of the goat. And if you recall, I think Rashi then told us that maybe it was because there's different reasons why you might put a pouch on the goat. And we'll see now. But Tanya, there's a brisa that says the opposite. That a goat may go out into the public domain with this covering. Oh, I need to add one more thing. It's important whenever we have our conversations here to recall if the issue is you can't do it, period, or you can't go to the public domain. Much of our discussion has been about going into the public domain. So just to add, the pouch, we're not saying you can't have it on Shabbos, we're saying you can't go to shul if you have to go through public domain. We're not saying that a goat necessarily can't have this covering, we're saying that it can't go into the public domain. Whereas when we're talking about taking off the saddle there, we may have been talking about, or certain other putting items on the animal, there were times that we were talking about not doing it, period, even in the Rishus Hayachid. So we just need to be mindful of what we're talking about here. So here we're talking about lo yetze. You can't go out into the public domain, it would be considered carrying. Or maybe it'll come off, as we'll see soon. But Tanya, on the other hand, there's a brisa that permits a goat to have this pouch to protect its udders. Rav Yehuda gives answer number one, which is Loi Kasha. The two contradictory brises are not contradictory. They're describing two very different scenarios. One is that it is very tightly affixed. And Rashi says it's very well attached. We are not concerned that it'll fall off and the owner will end up carrying it. Because again, one of our grave concerns, and Rebel, you brought this to our attention several days ago when we were summarizing the reason why we might restrict an animal from wearing something. So reason one we said was masoy, a burden, but the other issue was if the owner might carry it. And Rashi tells us if it's well attached, that's not a concern. Therefore, the brisa permits the goat wearing it on its udders. And when we say it's prohibited, it's because it's not really tightly attached and it will fall off with greater ease, and therefore you cannot do so.
So could we apply this also to the person?
Because the Gemara didn't, let's not. Let's wait and see the Gemara's discussion of it in the next chapter. Rav Yosef gives another answer. So Rav Yehuda says the two contradictory texts are not a contradiction because they're describing two different scenarios. Rabbi Yosef answers, Tanoi Shakalta Mialma, have you forgotten that there are occasionally different opinions in the world of the sages of the Mishnah and the Brisa? Rashi, Ibadata Kulam, Sheinat Moitzi Tanoim Shenechliku Bakach. Have you never found a sage of the Mishnah that had an argument in this very subject? The Toki Hanach Tarti Masnis and Chada Kamar V'Chada Kamar. Couldn't we easily connect the two contradictory Brisas to two known Mishnaic or Tanoic positions? Mishnah and Tana, by the way, the same thing. The text is called the Mishnah. The Tanoim are the sages and the authorities of the Mishnah. Tanoihi, this is a known Mishnaic debate between two Tanoim. The Tanan, I'll give you the quotation, the citation. Ha'izim yoitzai suras. We're taught in a Mishnah, our Mishnah, that goats can go out sirurot with bound udders. Rabbi Yossi Oyser Bekulam, and Rabbi Yossi says no, they may not. Besides for the sheep, the sheep that are kivunais, which we didn't explain yet what kivunais are. Rabbi Yehuda Omer izim yotzes strudelis liyabesh avaloi lecholev, and a third opinion says it depends. So opinion A: goats may be bound. Opinion B: goats may not have their udders bound. Opinion 3 or C is depends. Izim yotzes strudelis liyabesh avaloi lecholev. Depending on the nature and the purpose of the binding of the udders, will determine if it may or may not be done. When the goats are tied up to cause the milk to dry up, that may be done. But if the binding is in a way to capture the milk or to preserve the milk, which means it's loosely bound, that is prohibited. Taisvis here, no, Taisvis in the next, so let's, all right, give me another. Alternatively, we could say Hava Rabbi Yehuda. Both brises are in accordance to Rabbi Yehuda here, we just quoted, who says that a goat can be bound if it's to dry the milk, but not to capture the milk. Hava Rabbi Yehuda, we could say both brises are expressions of Rabbi Yehuda. Vilakashia, but there's no contradiction. Kam liyabish, kam lechalav. The brises are describing two different scenarios. Liyabish, mehadek shapir. What does it mean that it's done to dry? It's really well attached. Ule'inin in masoi nami loy have a masoi. Rebberal, you're going to ask, hold on. Mela, it's not going to fall off. But why isn't it considered a burden? The tzoyrech gufahi. It is necessary for the animal's well-being. The chalbo machisha, a nursing animal, is weakened. Or alternatively, a nursing animal cannot be involved in breeding. So for whatever the exact reason, Rashi says it's because when the animal is milking or produces milk, it becomes weakened. Therefore, it's Sayrich Gufa, it's for the benefit and the well-being of the animal. And therefore, our only concern is, therefore, it's allowed to be worn. But if it's there to capture the milk, have a masoi shatay as a chalav shabakis. If it's loosely affixed and it's capturing the milk, so then this would certainly be a burden. It's not for the well-being of the animal. It's because the owner wants to capture the milk, and that may not be done. Again, two brisas, seemingly in a contradiction about the permissibility of having protection, a binding on the udders. The Gemara answers three answers. Either one is about it's tightly attached and it's not going to fall off. It's loosely attached and it will fall off. Answer B is that there are two different opinions expressed in the Mishnah about if one may or may not have the animal's udders bound. Or option 3, the two contradictory brises are both expressions of the views of Rabbi Yehuda. One is when it's affixed in a way to dry up the milk. That's okay because it's for the well-being of the animal. And but if the one that says you may not do so, it's because it's capturing the milk. And according to Rashi's explanation, it would be carrying a masoi, a burden. And as we know, animals may not carry their burden on Shabbos. There are other nuanced ways of understanding what liyabesh and lechalav mean. But I think Tosfos asked a whole bunch of questions. But for now, we're at the very end of our shir. Let's enjoy and appreciate Rashi's explanation to help deal with the contradiction of the brises. Let's just throw in one more text over here. We have one more minute. Tanya, a brayta that says as follows: Amar Rabbi Yehuda taught, Maseh be'izim shel Antuchya. There was once a situation where the goats of Antioch, Shahayu Dadehem Gasim, they had very large udders. The Asulam Kisin Kadeshla Yisartu Dadehem, and they were so large, it was necessary to create pouches to protect their udders from dragging on the ground and becoming injured. And so you're going to ask me, who cares We're just here for to yent about the size of the udders of the goats of Antioch. So obviously, we're also commenting that they were allowed to go out with those pouches on Shabbos. That would have to be the explanation over here, that it's teaching us that they were allowed to be protected, and this would be consistent with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. If it's for the animals' well-being, they're allowed to have protection, kis. They're allowed to be bound on the udders, and that would not be a problem. And so this is a halachic. This is not a yenta comment, but this is an important halachic proof or further confirmation of the viewpoint of Rabbi Yehuda. Tomorrow's Gemara is going to start with a very interesting miracle story that's going to bring up all different kinds of very, very interesting contemporary issues. I hope you'll join us tomorrow. Until then, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a wonderful day. And let me just mention, because we mentioned it, but it wasn't recorded, today we were learning and observing or preparing to mark the yahrzeit for Yosef and Levi Yitzchak. And today we are marking, or rather tonight, I believe, right, Mark? It's tonight?
Today.
Today we're marking the yahrzeit of Meir ben Alexander. That's Reb Mark Weinstock, one of our most devoted members' grandfather. And so his neshama shav and aliyah, and the learning should be a beautiful schus to his neshama, and certainly the devotion of the Torah that his grandson and mishpacha have is the greatest tribute. So yasher koyach, and wish everyone a wonderful day. Please join us tomorrow, same time, same place, same link. Again, we're going to start with a great story. Don't peek ahead, or you could. If you peek ahead, we'll have even more to talk about. So have a wonderful day. Thank you all.
Just remember, you use the word
Good night.
depends. We're going to get to that. Zayg is in.
Oh, we're going to end this link, and then you'll please rejoin to study today's Chumash, Ezra session.
And we'll see you at yeshiva night. Or some of us.
Let me see if this will help. No, just want to change the name of the class. Maybe it'll change.